Welcome to week 5 of our class, learning Rabbi Benjamin Blech's book, Understanding Judaism, the Basics of Deed and Creed. Every week we've had more and more people come. The classes are all online if you want to catch up, but a very quick summary of where we are as we begin part 3 of the book in chapter 6. First, I wanted to say that we are learning in the merit of a refuah shlema for our friend Aviva Galia Basima. And so please keep that in mind and her health while we learn tonight. We'll be doing it in the merit of her recovery. Thanks also to Jody Barris and the Park City Jewish Collective for organizing this. Thanks to the Refreshments Committee. Thanks to the Audiovisual Committee. We have a couple of chapters that we're going to do tonight that take us beyond, obviously, where we've been. What we've done is the first 2 sections of the book tell us basically that all of the commandments are equal. There are no big ones, there are no little ones. If you think it's a little one, that means you're ignoring it, and who are we to choose which commandments God said were important? Well, then you could ask a question. Well, how about the 10 Commandments? They seem pretty important. So we learned that the 10 Commandments is actually a myth. There are no 10 Commandments. We call them the Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 Commandments, the 10 utterances, the 10 sayings. And what we've been learning in the past couple of weeks is that those 10 utterances are principles, big principles, that all of the other commandments fall under. So every commandment that you pick, there is one of the 10 commandments will fall under that category. An example of that is one of the commandments is that you should keep Shabbos. Okay, well, what falls under that? Well, obviously all the laws related to Shabbos, but also any of the Jewish holidays that are related to time, that are come at a certain place on the calendar. The principle of Shabbat tells us that we can follow God's way, not only by being in a place, but also by being in a time, and the idea of time. So I want to start off tonight's, so just to say what we're going to cover tonight, there are 2 chapters here. One of the chapters is almost as short as my haircut, so it's really short. We are going to go through that first chapter, and then we're going to go into the second chapter. I don't know that we'll have time to get all the way through it, but there's a lot of substance to get into. Now, we've been basically talking about all these rules, that one commandment is not bigger than the other, and this is a rule, a principle, a foundation of Judaism. So who can tell me what every rule has?
An exception.
Every rule has an exception, and we're going to get into those exceptions tonight, because everything that we've talked about is everything's equal, everything's the same, we can't pick one over the other, is such a good rule that we have some exceptions to prove that it's a rule. And what I'm really excited about, before we finish tonight, we are going to answer a question that got me into trouble in week, I think it was 2. And that was, we're trying to give some context to the class and say that all this stuff is relevant to us today. And some of the things we're learning, we learned that if a soldier in Israel today is recovering a hostage or working in that effort, they are exempt from the other commandments. So you may say, well, don't they have to do the afternoon prayer? Well, if they're in the middle of a mission, no, they don't have to, because they're engaged in one mitzvah. And what we learned earlier is that if you're in the middle of one mitzvah, you can't stop doing that one and then do another one, because you're doing one mitzvah. And we're going to have an exception to that rule here. But when I explained that when they're in battle and when they're trying to recover hostages, they can't then stop to do another mitzvah, we acknowledge that, the attack took place on Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah, a holiday, and the soldiers, many of them were in prayer. They were observing the holiday, God's holiday. And they had to stop what they were doing to go and defend themselves and defend their communities. So you could say, didn't we just learn that you're not supposed to stop one mitzvah for another, because if you stop one mitzvah for another, you're choosing which one is more important. You're putting one down and saying the other one is more important. And I didn't have an answer to that, because it's a good question. Because, if you stopped the holiday, even though we just said don't stop one mitzvah for another, we're actually going to learn by the end of tonight's class why you should. Why not only you should, why you have to. And so that's going to be part of the exceptions, because we're choosing one over the other, but we're going to get into why that is. So the idea is that, and this is something that Jody answered also in one of the first classes, when we talked about the 10 Commandments, that there were 2 categories of the commandments. And Jody had the right answer, that the first category is between The first category?
Between man and God.
Man and God. And the second category?
Man and man.
Between man and man. So let's keep that in mind, that when we have these 10 commandments, we know that God put the commandments on 2 tablets. Why were there 2? There must be some reason why they were 2. Is the first 5 are related to man and God, and then the second 5 are related to man and man. And we're going to get into which of those are more important if there is a conflict. But before we do that, we've always talked about some comparative religion, and I always say when we do comparative religion, we're not putting one religion down, we're just making a distinction, and I hope I can relay that as delicately as Rabbi Blech does in his book. And he says, many people are unaware that Catholics, Protestants, and Jews do not agree on which commandments make up the Decalogue. You would think there would be an agreement, 10 commandments, we could all at least agree there are 10. We know there are 10, but those 10 are not numbered. And that gets us into some trouble. And the Catholics and Protestants have a good point, because our first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. That's number 1. And you could say, well, what kind of commandment is that? It's a statement of fact. Well, number 1 is we've already learned that these 10 commandments aren't actually commandments, they're principles. So our first commandment of the 10, our first principle of the 10, is an important principle that dictates really all the other 612, which is, I am Lord your God. That's what you have to acknowledge. That's the source of all of these other commandments. In fact, though, most commentators agree that it is a commandment to accept God, as well as to verbalize the acceptance. Stanton, who I know is watching online, would say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, acknowledging the oneness of God. And saying that is fulfilling that first commandment, that first principle. But it's not only that. In all 612 other commandments that we do, it is important to acknowledge the source of that commandment. So it's not enough just to be a good person and do good things. While doing them, it is imperative to have in mind that I'm doing these because the source of these is God, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So the Protestants and the Catholics have a problem with the 10 commandments, because if they're following our 10, and our first one is, I'm the Lord your God, and they don't see that as a commandment, what do? So they say it's not a commandment. The Catholics and the Protestants don't even agree on it. The Catholics count our second commandment, you shall have no other God before me, as the first, and continue one commandment short until they reach the end, when they come to, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. They have only counted 9 commandments, so what's their 10th? You should not covet your neighbor's wife. So our 10th commandment is, thou shalt not covet, and here are 2 examples, the house and the wife. The Catholics, because they didn't accept our first commandment as a commandment, they had to come up with a 10th, and they took number 9, or our number 10, and split it in 2. The Protestants have the same problem, because they don't see the first commandment, our first commandment, as a commandment. So what do? What for the Jews is the second category, idolatry, becomes the Protestants' 2 separate laws. You shall have no other gods before me is the first, and you shall not make yourself a graven image, you shall not bow down unto them or serve them, is their second. So they split up the earlier one, and then they just continue the way we do. Just for clarity's sake, because I don't think we're all clear, the 10 that we have. Number 1, I am the Lord your God. That is a commandment because it's a statement, and then we have to incorporate that into all the others. You shall not have other gods before me. That's our second. Our third is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The fourth, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Now pay attention here. The fifth, the end of the first category, honor your father and mother. Number 6, you shall not murder. 7, you shall not commit adultery. 8, you shall not steal. 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And 10 is, you shall not covet the wife and the house, all is one commandment. So Rabbi Blech asks, along the lines of Jody's answer a few weeks ago, was, why did God choose to divide these laws and place them on 2 separate tablets? And the answer to that is because there are these 2 categories. God placed the summary of Jewish law on the 2 tablets because the law itself has a dual concern. Judaism teaches that all of the law may be divided into two categories: our relationship with God, which are the first five, and our relationship with the people is...
How about the fifth one of the...
Yes. How about it?
It sounds like between people, right? Your parents.
Excellent question. So if the first five, and we've all kind of agreed, the first five are between man and God, and the second five are between people.
Well, you're supposed to think of Hashem as like your father too.
Yes. And you're supposed to think of your... What are your parents and Hashem have in common?
You're supposed to respect them, and they have, I think after you like reach a certain age, that they respect you too.
You like that one, right?
שלושה שותפים לו לאדם.
There you go. So, why is it that the honoring of your parents is in the first category when in fact it seems like it should be in the second? Well, we have an answer for that. Because the first five are really about our Creator. And our Creator is our parents and God. There are three partners in the creation of man. It says this in the Talmud: Mother, Father, and God. The text is clarifying the extent to which we owe gratitude to our human progenitors. The first tablet can therefore be summarized as our obligation to the Creator, creators. The second tablet defines the parameters of our daily existence as we involve ourselves with other human beings. The importance of this duality cannot be underestimated, and we're going to get into that today. And Rabbi Blech tells us a story, and similar to something we talked about in the first class. He says, as a rabbi, I'm often asked, how can you explain the fact that I know people who are religious, and yet, when one enters their place of business, one sees the most corruptive practices? And he says, okay, well, it's a good question, but you answer the question by in the way in you ask the question is false. Because you say this person is religious, but they're out there doing these other things. What I think you mean to say is they keep the first five, but they don't keep the second five. And if you keep the first five and you don't keep the second five, you know what happened? You're not religious, because you're denying the half of the Ten Commandments. And he has an interesting quote. When the Puritans came to these shores, Cotton Mather, the famous preacher, reflected on this same problem. And he said, woe to those who pray, P-R-A-Y, who pray with all their hearts to God on Sunday, and then pray, P-R-E-Y, prey upon their fellow man throughout the rest of the week. Orthodoxy would be well advised to be extremely careful of those who believe that religious fanaticism in the arena of their godly relationship allows them greater leeway to do as they see fit and to ignore the ethical strictures in the area of person-to-person relationship. And he cites an Israeli, like a famous Israeli cartoon, where there is a bank robber with his loot in the one hand and the gun in the other, who takes his weapon and puts it in his left hand, so when he leaves the bank, what can he do? He can kiss the mezuzah, right? So he's in the middle of bank robbery, but he still has to kiss the mezuzah. And that illustrates this failure to recognize that both of them are important.
What's a mezuzah?
A mezuzah is something that we put on our door, that we kiss it to acknowledge, and the prayer of Shema Yisrael is in the mezuzah, in the scroll. And it's ironic that he's literally acknowledging God by kissing the Shema, while at the same time ignoring one of the big principles of the Ten Commandments. And he says that at the same time, this schizophrenia may be found among secularists in equal measure. Those who loudly profess their religious piety because of their commitment to the tenets of the second tablet, basically, I'm a good person, they're ignoring the first five. Religion, we were told at Sinai, cannot be split. To defraud while posing as a religious person is criminal. To violate the Sabbath or to worship idols is to negate the source of sanctity that allows for the spiritual perfection of the universe. The problem is, there will be times when these two major principles, right? So we've boiled down 613 commandments to 10 principles. And then among those 10 principles, we've boiled it down to two categories between man and their creators, and man. So we've got like these categories, very easy to see, and we've always said that the rule is that we see them each as important, and we don't say one commandment is bigger than the other. So what happens, and this is where we're going to get into some interesting stuff, is what happens when there is a conflict between those two, between those first two categories. And we're in the quandary where we say, okay, well, nothing is more important than the other, so what do I do? How do I choose? So he brings up some stories. The first one is from Bereshit, from the first book of the Torah. And it's a famous story when Abraham circumcised himself, right? He got circumcised, but he did it to himself. And when he did that, we know that after a surgery, the third day is the hardest. The third day is the most painful. And on that third day, the Lord appeared to Abraham in the groves of Mamre, and he sat at the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and 3 men were standing directly towards him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed down to the earth. And he said to their leader, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be fetched. Wash your feet. Rest under the tree. I'll fetch a morsel of bread, and you will eat to your heart's content. Then you shall pass on, for this is the reason you passed by your servant." In other words, these 3 people came by. Abraham, who was recovering from his circumcision on the hardest day in the heat of the day, was out there waiting for guests to pass by, and he could do the commandment of welcoming in a guest and giving them something to drink and eat. God had come to visit Abraham. According to our sages, God was fulfilling the mitzvah of visiting the sick. It was 3 days after Abraham had undergone his circumcision. He was in great pain. Yet he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day, hoping that he could do this commandment. So each one of our forefathers exhibited one unique and very special trait. In the Mishnah, the ethics of our fathers, it teaches us that the world rests upon 3 basic principles: on Torah, on sacrifice, and on showing kindness to one's fellow man. So Jacob was the perfect man who lived in tents. He would demonstrate the pinnacle that could be reached by the study of Torah. Whereas Isaac, in the supreme moment of his life, bound to the altar on top of Mount Moriah, ready to sacrifice his life. So we've got these different categories. And what Abraham was famous for was his kindness to other people. And the sages teach us that we're to learn from them. On the simplest level, the story we cited from the Torah portion is meant to show us that even though Abraham did not know that the men he was approaching were angels, as far as he was concerned, they could have been idol worshippers, it was his mitzvah, it was his mission. I'm going to go be a host. That's like Abraham's thing. But something else was going on here, because Abraham at the moment was praying to God. He was in the presence of God. That too is a mitzvah. Standing before the Lord entails the duty of prayer. And how did Abraham, in the middle of prayer, could you imagine you're in the middle of this intense encounter with God? Oh, wait a second. I have company. I wasn't expecting them. And Abraham does that. He leaves the presence of God. Now, when we pray, we try to feel like we're in the presence of God. But Abraham was like really in the presence of God. And he didn't know that these 3 people who came to see him were angels and were sent by God. And he just thought these are people. I don't know who they are. They may be pious people. They may be idol worshipers. But I'm going to go offer them a drink. I'm going to have them sit down and take a rest. I'm going to do my mission of caring for them. So it says, Abraham was not merely fulfilling the mitzvah of hospitality. He was leaving God. Think of the first 5. He was leaving God to take care of man. Think of the second 5. He made a decision concerning priorities. The Talmud in Shabbat derives an important conclusion from this incident. It is a great mitzvah to take in strangers. It is a greater mitzvah to take in strangers than to receive the divine countenance. Wow. Who would have thought that if you're engaged directly with God, that we can learn from Abraham that we say, sorry, God, I got your people here. I got to go take care of them. That's what you're supposed to do. It was, the Talmud says it was not simply one specific mitzvah against another. It wasn't praying against welcoming in guests. It was a confrontation between the two categories. Both God and man beckoned. Abraham understood when faced with a conflict between the two, he must choose man over God. Who would have thought we would have learned that? But this Talmud is not the only source for this idea that we have to choose the second five over the first five. Hillel the elder reached a conclusion in this story of the heathen who came to convert and asked to be taught the entire Torah on one foot. Imagine someone said, I want to know what's this religion all about, but just tell it to me on one foot. And usually the way we interpret that is quickly, like sum it all up for me. I'm not interested in a weekly class. Just what's this all about? The renowned scholar Shammai chased the man away. How dare you ask to teach the whole thing on one foot? This is complex. There's a lot of substance to it. It's taking us all winter to get to the basics of the foundations. But Hillel responded by rephrasing the famous verse, and this is the answer to the question, teach me the Torah on one foot. He said, I'll teach you the Torah on one foot. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. What did the prospective convert mean when he asked, teach me on one foot? The standard interpretation is a quick response, but it has been suggested, however, that he was alluding to something else. The Torah also has 2 feet. At the Seder we sing, on Passover we sing, who knows 2, right? I know 2. 2 are the tablets. There are 2 tablets. And this heathen said, I want just one of them. Teach me the entire Torah on one foot may well be the very same question we posed regarding priorities within Judaism. If God is concerned with 2 dimensions, which one is more basic? Is God there for humanity, or is humanity there for God? Shammai refused to entertain the question. Hillel, however, would not dodge the challenge. Right? So Shammai is like, you can't do it in one foot because there are 2 feet. And so Hillel actually said, I'm going to answer your question. When Hillel reiterated the words, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, the words that would serve as the most fundamental principle of the Torah, he was saying that love of humanity is the one foot to choose over any other commandment of love in the Torah. So Hillel could have come back and quoted the Shema, Stanton's prayer, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That makes it pretty clear you should love God first. But he didn't. He didn't say that was the answer. He chose the obligation to love our neighbor. We must recognize that the most significant dimension of this famous Talmudic story is not just what was said, but what wasn't. If a choice must be made, then just as Abraham did, leave God and take care of a human being in need. So what's the rationale for this decision? Why would you do that? Does anybody want to guess? Anybody have any ideas? So there are 2 answers that we can come up with. The first refers to need. A person may be hungry, starving, or even on the verge of death. These needs do not apply to God. So it's a very practical answer. Since human need is so much greater, God ordained that we leave him, for the moment, to take care of another person. Now here is really, I think, the kicker of this whole section, the kind of the fundamental essence of it. That certainly must be the intent of the Talmudic passage describing the chassid sota, which is a pious fool. Think about a pious fool. It is one who, standing at the seashore, engaged in prayer, refuses to heed the call for help of a drowning man because he's in the middle of service to God. To allow a human being to drown because you are busy telling God how much you care about him and his world is the ultimate hypocrisy. You've got a human being in need, and you're saying, no, I'm talking to God. Well, what's the point of talking to God if you ignore the person drowning? What God was trying to tell you when you were talking to him is, go save the person drowning. That's not ignoring God. That's following God's commandment. And God wants you to separate yourself from him so you can go do what he told you to do. So keep in mind this idea of the pious fool. So he says there's another reason, a more concise and even a scientific reason, for why our response to human need takes preference over our response to God. We've talked about the great philosopher Maimonides in the past. He puts it well, and he explains that every ethical act of goodness and kindness to another person is intrinsically a mitzvah, a commandment. Every observance of religious ritual being commanded by God is also a mitzvah, a deed assuming its religious identity because God demanded it. The divine imperative invests it with sanctity. Likewise, every law governing person to person, the second category, is also an expression of the will of God, and consequently is a divine imperative. Now, the mitzvah towards others is doubly blessed. It comes from God, and it achieves the good for others. A commandment on the first tablet, a commandment on the first tablet is a +1. It's a commandment from God. It's good because God said so. But a law on the second tablet is a +2 because it relates to both our relationship to other people, obviously, and our relationship to God. So I'm doing good for other people, which is good, but I'm doing good for other people because God told me to be good to other people, so I'm doing God's commandment. So it's actually a double mitzvah. There are two bases for it. So now we're going to draw a little bit of a contrast where he talks about two generations of evil. There are two principles of evil that took place early in our history. These aren't simply events that took place, but they're archetypes. The first two rebellions in history serve as paradigms for the way in which humankind can go against the will of the Creator. The first rebellion was staged by the generation of the deluge, the flood, and the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted with it on its way of the earth. So the section of the reading refers to violence, that there was violence among the earth. So which category would that be a violation of, the first or the second? The second. Now, interesting, I promise you we're not going back to the gematria, to the numbers game of the words, but the word violence in the Torah is Hamas. That's the word from this pasuk, the word Hamas.
For real?
For real. Now, Hamas they didn't name themselves violence, although maybe they could have. But
Something else in Arabic.
it is something else in Arabic, exactly. It is the Islamic Resistance Movement. And it is the acronym for, we would say IRM. If you translated Islamic Resistance Movement to Arabic, it would be something with the H sound, something with the M sound, and something with the S sound. It would be Hamas. Interesting that their name is violence. And we talked about how Hebrew words tend to be the essence of things. And we never knew the word Hamas actually throughout history until it's in Tehillim, about violence. You read your Tehillim?
Well, yeah, 'cause
What
So-
is Tehillim?
Tehillim are psalms. Would you call them psalms? There's
yeah.
prayers that we say, or statements, or stories that we tell. So it's just interesting that the word Hamas is a Hebrew word, but they took it and ran with it. So these people who, in the time of the flood, their fate was not sealed except on account of theft. The Torah states the earth was corrupt before God, to tell us that although they acknowledged God, they rejected the interpersonal ethics and laws that would later be known for the second tablet. The second rebellion was a very different type of rebellion. And it was the story of the Tower of Babel. And people said, this is a change in human development in the history of the world. It was a turning point. We went from being farmers and working in the fields to being builders and moving towards the era of enlightenment. And in the yes.
They climbed their way. They tried to climb their way up to God.
They tried to climb their way up to God. They said, we can build. So we can build one story, we can build two stories, we could build three stories. They got so good at building and they said, we're going to build our way up to God. We'll go higher than God and we'll take over. And what God said was not so fast, right? He said, I'm going to give you all you people trying to work together to climb up to me, which is a foolish concept. Different languages. So, pass the bricks. And the guy said, what do you mean, pass? I don't know what that means. You're talking another language. And they couldn't communicate with each other. Now, think about the two punishments. The punishments of the first archetype category, violence, man against man. What was their punishment in the flood? Death. They were drowned. They were destroyed. So what does God think about when you ignore the second category?
Not good.
Really bad. The second one, the Tower of Babel, what was their...
Minor. Well, not minor. It was like...
He laughed. Basically, God was laughing at it. It's so ridiculous that you're going to do this. The Talmud in Sanhedrin says, we will build a tower that reaches so high and will be able to come to the very throne of the Almighty and topple him. So he says these are two paradigms of evil. At Sinai, they would each be addressed in a different manner. When God would bring law to the world, he would recall the dual capacity for sin. The first tablet would be directed to future generations that would try to duplicate the crime of the Tower of Babel builders. The second would address itself to the men and women of violence of all ages who long ago perished in the flood. The archetypes of sin are meant not only to teach us of possibilities and potentials, the two stories in their glaringly different conclusions serve also to convey the lesson of the relative levels of sin. When his human creations became corrupt and violent, God wiped them off the face of the earth. The wicked were destroyed. The Tower of Babel had a radically different outcome. Quote, come, let us go down and confound their language, that they many not understand one another's speech. Each one began to speak a different language. The age of technology ended with babbling, hence the Tower of Babel. That's why it's called the Tower of Babel, because they were babbling. Whatever they heard each other saying was nonsense. That's why it's called the Tower of Babel. A threat to humanity is real. A threat against God is humorous. The first is dangerous and must be dealt with severely. The second is ludicrous, and its proponents are simply scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. So again, this goes back to these two categories, not only in terms of the positive commandments, but how can we get them wrong and how are they dealt with? And what we're beginning to see emerge is this pattern that God takes the first five, the ones towards man and his creators, as these are commandments. But God is like, yeah, don't mess with me, follow my laws. But really, don't mess with your fellow human beings. Be kind to them. That we're seeing is the exception to the rule that none are more important than others. When there is a conflict between the two, we're starting to see both in the positive and also in the negative.
What if you're doing the other five, not because of God,
Yes.
because you feel that it's the right thing to do?
Yes. So that's what we talked about before. Someone is like, I'm a good person. I have company. I have guests. I'm a good person. Why do I need God? So we're going to get to that answer in about 5 minutes. But it's the fundamental question that we're building towards. So I don't want to give it away until we build through the drama. So we're going to learn some now specific examples about these conflicts. There's a special mitzvah called mate mitzvah. Mate is when someone dies. It's a commandment over when someone dies. Do you know it?
It's one of the biggest mitzvahs because you can't give it back. Like, you host someone, they'll host you back. You can't, let's say you bury someone who's dead. They can't wake up from the dead and bury you.
They can't do you a favor back. Right. So
You don't really
even
do anything for them.
chesed shel emet, the true kindness. So we've learned in the first few classes that there is no big mitzvah or little mitzvah, but if the idea is you're doing a commandment just so I can get something back, it's not such a solid fulfillment of that commandment. But when you bury the dead, you don't have anything. You don't have any expectations to get anything in return.
Respect the person.
Yeah, it's just respect for the person and for humanity and for God. But there's a unique category. So if you lose a family member, it's your responsibility to bury that family member. But what happens if someone is out traveling in between cities, and there are no relatives, and that person dies? When a relative of yours dies, you have an obligation to bury your relative. The rest of us don't have an obligation to do that. However, when someone dies and there's no relative there, we all have that commandment to bury that person. It's incumbent upon all of us. The Talmud, it says, such a corpse is called a mitzvah, for it is the duty of every single Jew to be involved with his burial. The Talmud outlines a number of situations in which this law applies, even for those whom we might assume would be exempt. So who is responsible to bury someone that has nobody else to bury them? And the Talmud... Everyone. But not only everyone. A father on the way to circumcise his son, or to slaughter his paschal offering. A Kohen, a priest on the way to a sacrificial service when we had the temple. If the Kohen Gadol, the top guy in charge of the sacrifices, on Passover, doing the Paschal Lamb, or on Yom Kippur, is about to do this, and someone dies out in the field, it's incumbent upon that chief priest, the Kohen Gadol, to do the mitzvah, to bury the person. So you could ask, what happened to the halachic ruling that we talked about in weeks 2 and 3, that a person engaged in the performance of one mitzvah is exempt from the other? Why wasn't that applied here? Why didn't Abraham apply it when he was in the middle of his mitzvah of speaking to God? Or, as we talked about earlier, and this really answers the question that we had some trouble with a few weeks ago, is if the soldiers were in the middle of prayer on Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeres on October 7th, and they were praying to God, and then they said, hey, there's an emergency, we got to get our guns and go, and they stopped. A few weeks ago, I didn't have an answer to that question. Why did they stop? We just learned that no thing is more important than the other. If you're in the middle of the one, you can't choose to stop it and say that one's more important, because who are we to choose? Well, we're not choosing. There's no choice. God instructs us that it's, yeah.
How about the swimming story?
Right.
The guy's praying and he let the guy go.
Right. So that is what we call the pious fool. Right? He claims to be pious, but he's really a fool, because he's saying, I am following God. And it's the same. The pious fool example would be the Israeli soldiers who on October 7th said, oh yeah, they're terrorists killing our innocent civilians. I'll get to that after I'm done with the prayer today. They were not pious fools. They understood that they're not doing anything wrong by stepping away from God. They're following God, who said, put man before God. Right? We know that we have to put man before God because we see how the people were punished in Babel, how they were punished for ignoring God. And in fact, the real sin is ignoring your fellow people, being the pious fool.
The principle is saving the life in front of you.
To save the life in front of you. And your excuse for not saving the life in front of you is you're praying to God? That's preposterous. So clearly the man who was en route to redeem captive was told to ignore the holiday of Sukkot and continue on his way, because the conflict pitted the law of governing human relations against those governing human-divine relationship. In such a case, one proceeds with redeeming the captive and does not choose the sukkah. We talked about that in the earlier class. Now, that exemption applies only if the conflicting laws are from the same category. So the idea that you can't pick one for the other is, in the first 5, you can't choose one over the other, and in the second 5, you can't choose one or the other. So if you're doing a kindness to your fellow person, and then there's an opportunity to welcome in a guest, you can't say, hey, I can't be kind to you anymore because I have a guest coming. You can't choose really between the two categories. And God's telling us here that when it comes between man and God, choose man first. God will be there for us. God wants us to go help fellow man. So don't use I'm praying to God as an excuse not to help your fellow man. Has anyone here been on a subway in the city of New York? So I live in Manhattan when it's not snowing here. And it drives me crazy when I see somebody, a very pious person with the black hat and the black thing, and very religious appearing person. And they're sitting there on the subway in their book, and they're learning the Gemara, they're learning complicated stuff. And there I am on the subway, I'm like listening to music or something, and I say, who am I? This person is so pious. He's studying even on the subway. And what happens is, a pregnant woman walks in. Sometimes, an immigrant, a poor, pregnant, hardworking woman walks in, or she's carrying a baby. And if I'm sitting in the seat, obviously, I think whether I'm religious or not, I'm going to get up and give her my seat. And unfortunately, sometimes I see the guy in the book so religious he doesn't even look up to see the world around him. And that's an opportunity for a mitzvah, a big mitzvah, an important mitzvah. And certainly if you're wearing your kippah and people see you as a Jewish person, it's a kiddush Hashem. It's a nice thing to do. It shows that we have good ethics. So it always bothers me when I see the person in his book. What could he possibly be learning that's more important than seeing the world around him and getting up to let this woman sit down? To me, that's another example of the pious fool. What did you read? Maybe you were reading that you should be kind to your fellow person. But how can you be kind to your fellow person if you're so focused on the book and you don't look around you? I think that's, to me, is a real world example of this. So again, when one is confronted with the pressing need of another person, then of course one would have to be a pious fool to proceed with the service of God and ignore the pressing need of a human being who, unlike the deity, is not self-sufficient. So here's a really cool example of this. So when we make Kiddush on Friday night or on a holiday, we make a blessing. We make a blessing over a mitzvah. When we shake the lulav and esrog on Sukkot, we make a blessing. There are many commandments that we don't just do the commandment, we say a blessing over the commandment. So he asked, does a mitzvah have a blessing? Of course it does. Before we listen to the shofar, sit in the sukkah, we make a blessing acknowledging the divine source of the law and thanking God for giving us the opportunity to fulfill his will. Yet we know there are many commandments, mitzvot, that do not have a blessing recited before them. Which one? Yep. Visiting the sick, giving charity, inviting strangers. It's not like a guest comes in and you say, thank you, Lord Almighty, for giving me the responsibility to care for my guests. We don't say that blessing. Or charity. You don't say, okay, I'm about to put money in the tzedakah box. Let me say the blessing over charity. We visit the sick, give charity, invite strangers without making a blessing. Clearly, there is something that these acts have in common that do not demand words of praise to God. The Jewish law has made the following distinction. Only person to God commandments require a blessing. So if you're doing Kiddush, which is Shabbat, you say a blessing. If you're shaking the lulav and esrog on Sukkot, you say a blessing. Person-to-person obligations do not. Why not? One beautiful explanation emerges in a moving story. A sage once approached by a poor man begging for food. Before responding, the sage continued with his religious duties. The starving indigent was so far gone, however, that he died before help was offered. The rabbi spent a lifetime trying to atone for his sin. We learn from this that to take time to utter a blessing while another human being is in need is to commit the crime of the pious fool who pays attention to God while ignoring those in desperate need. So it's, I think, a pretty good question is why do we have blessings before a commandment? And why do some not have blessings? Because if our fellow man needs our help, that is such a priority that we don't even hesitate to thank God for commanding us to help our fellow man, because that fellow man is in need right now. Don't say the blessing. That God says, I know you have good intentions. Go help him now. Don't wait. Another example that hones in on this. Twice we reached great heights of spirituality. 2 times in history, we were able to build the Holy Temple. Both times, and you should note it was on the very same date. Which date?
9th day of
On the 9th day of Av. All right, Ken.
Yeah, Ken.
Okay.
On the same day, both of those temples were destroyed. A Jew does not believe that the destruction of the temples came about principally because of the Babylonians and the Romans. The month of Av, what does Av mean?
Father.
Father. The month of Av, which means father, because our Father in heaven was involved. The day was the 9th of Av, because on that day, during their wanderings in the desert, the Jewish people sinned in the incident of the spies when they cried and said, "We cannot go to Israel." Sin was responsible for the destruction of both temples because the spiritual symbol deserved to exist only so long as spiritual reality existed among the people. But the specific crime of the Jews was different on each occasion. 2 temples, 2 sins, 2 tablets, 2 archetypal sins going back to the story of the generation of the flood and the Tower of Babel. The first temple was destroyed because the Jews worshipped idols. Humankind rejected God, kind of similar to the story of the Tower of Babel. The second temple was destroyed because of needless hatred between Jews, sinat chinam, a most horrible conclusion of the incident of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. The Talmud relates that a man mistakenly invited his enemy to a lavish banquet and then realized he made a mistake and humiliated the person by ordering him to leave. The disgraced guest, angry that leading rabbis who observed the incident had not objected to his humiliation, exacted revenge by turning Caesar against the Jews, setting into motion the destruction of the temple. Jews do not deserve a temple if they reject either tablet totally. But let us compare the severity of punishment in these 2 major archetypal events of our history. The first temple lay in ruins for 70 years. The second temple, however, touched upon a far more fundamental area. Jews hating fellow Jews brought about a catastrophe whose effect have lasted from the year 70 of the Common Era to this very day. So the idea that there are these 2 categories, there are these 2 types of sins between man and man and God, and the idea that the punishment in the story of Babel and the punishment when we reject one of the 2 categories, the punishment is always much more harsh and much more lengthy when we violate the second category of commandments. We're going to run out of time before we get a chance to finish the chapter, but I want to kind of leave us in a place for next week where we talk about the idea between these 2 and when they're in conflict. How long are you going to be here for? Are you here next week? So it's not fair if I don't answer. What was the question that you asked?
I'm flying next Tuesday at midnight.
So what was the question that you asked before?
I don't think I can make it.
So the question...
About because you talked about the religious guy that don't do the next 5, and I have a friend who is Hametz and Passover, but I think he's a big tzaddik because he's very honest and he's really observing the Ben Adam Lachavero.
Mm-hmm.
He's so straight and so kind,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not believing in God even. You know?
Right.
Maybe he does, but definitely not. He's doing some mitzvot for tradition, but
Right. So what we're learning in this week's class and what we're going to follow through with next week is that God wants us to do both. So both categories are fundamental. The Torah has 2 feet between man and God, or between man and his creators, and between man and man. And it is not for us to choose one category over the other. You can't be a pious man who is so good that you ignore your neighbor. And at the same time, being kind to your neighbor is very important. But if you ignore the fact that the commandment to be kind to your neighbor came from a source, from a divine source, you're only getting half the story. So while it's good that we're righteous people, if we ignore the source from a religious perspective, in fact, we talked earlier about, I am the God your Lord. I am the Lord your God. When it says that, it's actually telling us when you do kindness to your fellow man, have in mind that God wanted you to do that. So you get the kind of double credit for it.
right.
If you're only doing half, whether it's the first half or the second half, you're only doing half. And what we are striving for is to develop ourselves in such a way where we can achieve both. And I think for many it'll be easier to achieve both if we know that the religious, if you will, the man and God category doesn't come before the man and man category. I think it's helpful for me, at least, is to say, okay, God, I'll be back. You wanted me to help this person. And that's not violating the will of God. It's keeping the will of God. So I think that's a good point to finish up on tonight's class with, unless there are any questions. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for watching online. We will be back next week with the end of this. And there are more exceptions that prove more rules coming up next week, which are going to be fun. Thank you.
We'll see.
Beautiful.
Excellent, excellent.
Good job on the contribution.